research fellow at the Hudson Institute here in Washington, D.C., and we are live for a panel discussion on the consequences of Brexit for the European Union. We have today a actually great panel in 4 different cities with Ben Judah, who is a British journalist talking from London, who is most notably the author of This is London, a reporting a book through the City of London that was published late last year, but also wrote a book called Fragile Empire on Vladimir Putin's Russia. We're also joined by Dalibor Rohac, who is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington, D.C. Dalibor is a Slovak economist and most recently the author of Towards an Imperfect Union, a conservative case for the European Union. We're also joined with Roland Freudenstein, who's talking to us from Brussels, and Roland is the head of the Martin Center, a center-right policy think tank with a specialty notably on European affairs and international affairs. And we will be joined a bit later by Manuel Lafont Rapnouil from Paris, who is a senior fellow and the head of the Paris office of the European Center for Foreign Relations. So with all 4 speakers today, we'll examine the consequences of Brexit and what's next for the European Union and European leaders. As you know, the Brexit referendum, which sent shockwaves through the financial markets, through the political world in the West and abroad, was held less than a week ago, last Thursday, and we're still in the midst of a lot of confusion and uncertainty. Uncertainty over what's next for the UK. As you know, David Cameron has announced his resignation. He will pass leadership at the next Conservative Party conference in October, but refuses to invoke Article 50, which lays the ground for gradual withdrawal in 2 years of the UK Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty of the European Union before his resignation, which still opens the way to months of debates and hesitation over this. We can see already disagreements and debates within European member states, notably France and Germany, over how to handle this situation. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of technical and political debates about this. So I think the objective for this is to try to clarify as much as possible what will come next, what should come next, and also what to expect from the United States in all of this, which is watching with a lot of wariness the confusion in Europe. Let's start with you, Ben. You're coming from London. You wrote a lot about this before and after the vote. How do you think the UK now is coming to grasp with what is its own decision from last week?
Well, I think the first and most important point to make is that this was, for all of the key players in the government, not supposed to happen. David Cameron didn't intend it to happen. The leaders of the Leave campaign, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, his key ally, the former and I guess technically still Justice Secretary, did not intend it to happen. What the leaders of the Leave campaign were intending was for a heroic defeat faced with the government, and for the government to then sort of continue with them greatly empowered to then grab power after Cameron's resignation some years later and further down the line. And even though Brexit was becoming increasingly popular and then ahead in the opinion polls, there was overwhelming belief in the London political establishment that it would play out just like the Scottish independence referendum, which Cameron won, and that there would be a so-called snapback to the status quo. And this was reinforced on the night of the vote when a series of inaccurate polls came about showing that Remain appeared to have won. And just to show to what extent people didn't realise this was supposed to happen, Michael Gove's wife has published an article today, frankly quite a shocking article, showing that after a sort of lovely dinner, Michael Gove had gone to bed at 10:30 in the evening and had woken up at 5 in the morning for a series of telephone calls and was shocked to discover that he had won, and was at first clueless how to react. So this shock has broken a whole series of British institutions. The first institution that it broke was the government, completely unexpectedly. The government is now not functioning. Cameron is a sort of titular caretaker leader. The previous sort of consigliere and the so-called octopus of the government, George Osborne, has had his political career smashed. Already we have intense jockeying from different parts of the Conservative Party to pull the party somewhere forward. There's no authority in this government. The government's intended reform programme, the government's so-called long-term economic plan lies in ruins. We don't know what is going to happen in the next few months. It's very unclear who will take over the leadership of this party. The second institution that was broken, and in incredibly dramatic style, was the opposition Labour Party, this grand old party, dating back to the beginning of the 20th century, staged a revolt against its MPs staged a revolt against its sort of hard left leader, with the overwhelming majority of MPs demanding that he stand down, and the leader has simply refused, calling mass protests organised by his Momentum organisation, which had been taking place outside Parliament. And this institution is completely paralysed. We have no idea whether it will split. It looks like there'll be a very difficult leadership campaign. The Labour Party is tearing itself apart between its membership, which broadly back the hard left leader Jeremy Corbyn, the leader's office, which are determined for Corbyn to stay. Corbyn is said to be personally exhausted, but is being demanded to stay by the sort of his hard-line advisor Seamus Milne, former editor of Comment is Free on The Guardian, and the MPs who are pulling in a completely different direction. Again, like in the Conservative Party, we have no idea who will take over and who exactly is running. The third institution that the unanticipated Brexit has broken is the Union. The Union with Scotland, a very cherished institution to the British establishment, is already not the same union that it was the day before Brexit. And there have been a couple of historic events that have taken place, which sort of buried by all the other ones have not quite been picked up on. And one is that Scotland, for the first time since the 1701 or 1703 or 4 in the build-up to the Act of Union, is now running an independent foreign policy, with the government in Edinburgh has stated its intention to remain within the European Union. It does not want to be pulled out of the European Union. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, has gone to Brussels, has made already alliances with key European politicians and with individuals within the sort of Council and the Commission have sort of met her. Scotland's Parliament has given Nicola Sturgeon the authority to continue to stand for Scotland's position in the European Union. It's crucial to say that all parties in Scotland have backed remaining within the Union, and that one of the leaders of the Remain campaign is the highly popular leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, Ruth Davidson. So the Conservative Party's broken, the government's broken, the Labour Party's broken, and the Union is broken. And that's not to mention other institutions in the British state which could ride to the rescue. The Foreign Office, in a state of shock, is broken and unable to respond. David Cameron had demanded that no government institution prepare Brexit plans in order not to encourage a vote for Brexit. So the Treasury finds itself broken. The only functioning institution in England is the Bank of England, led by the Canadian Mark Carney. So in a way, it is somewhat similar to the situation in the fall of the Soviet Union, when at a crucial moment in Soviet or Russian history, all institutions were broken at the same time, and there was none were able to ride to the rescue at the crucial moment. In another way, it's similar to the fall of the Soviet Union, in which a previously dormant nationalism i.e. either Russian nationalism or English nationalism, has suddenly risen to the surface, with the core nation demanding to leave a union, either the European Union or the Soviet Union, and a joke may be added that there is in both cases an out-of-control, over-promising Boris. There has been also three key things I'm going to mention before I sort of hand on, is that as I've been travelling around London, going from the city to Westminster to Whitehall and back again, I've met an extraordinary level of denial. The first level of denial is from the Brexiteers and the Conservative Party themselves, who are simply refusing to admit that they will not be offered what they want, which is full access to the single market and the benefits of the European Union without shouldering any of the costs and without shouldering any of the possible migration from it. The second level of denial is denial from the political forces that backed Remain and the social forces that backed Remain, in which it is widely believed right now in London that maybe Britain won't actually leave. Maybe there'll be another referendum. Maybe Article 50 will never be triggered. Maybe there'll be another election. And the third level of denial is denial that the City of London will suffer as a result of leaving the European Union. It appears not to have been broadly understood by the population or the political class at large that London would almost inevitably lose its euro clearing role. That's a market worth 600 billion to 1 trillion. So all of these levels of denial are mixing with all of these broken institutions and leading to a really quite an extraordinary period in London.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, when you look at the first reactions coming out of European leaders, it's very clear they're not going to be lenient on the United Kingdom. François Hollande today announced that he does not think the City of London should continue to play a role, as you said, in clearing the euro, and European leaders have also made clear that there's no possible belonging to the common market without accepting freedom of movement for people and good, and integrating part of European legislation, which had been one of the promise, obviously, of the Brexit partisans, saying you can have the common market without being part of the legislation of free movement of people. So
I think there was, first of all, the feeling that, okay, they really did it, they really left us alone with the French. And that was a fierce attack for some time in Berlin, simply because Britain had been an ally of Germany on so many individual issues of European integration. It was generally a more free-trading, market-oriented attitude. Smart fiscal policies, fiscal consolidation, not going into too much debt, Atlanticism, a certain attitude on Russia, on all these things. Also the size of the EU budget. Germany and Britain had been basically on the same page for more than 10 years. So there was the feeling that with Britain leaving, this counterweight to the old rivalry with France, which did exist, this was gone. Second, there was a recognition that, oh my God, so when the Americans want to talk to Europe, now they're really going to phone Angela Merkel only, or first. And, you know, as much as Germany has been uncomfortable with the leadership role that it had willy-nilly in the euro crisis since 2011, now we feel like, no, we're really the only ones. And believe it or not, but that's not a comfortable thing for the political class in Germany. And third, I think we discovered that Germany, of course, is within one subgroup. If you want to divide the remaining 27 members into 3 subgroups, more Mediterranean one, the Eastern European one, that wants less integration, and then you have a North European one where Germany is right in the middle, which is not about more Europe, not about less Europe, but about smarter Europe, and certainly limiting expenses and no transfer union in the Eurozone. So, I mean, that contains the Swedes, the Finns, the Baltic states, Ireland, the Netherlands and Austria, and Germany right in the middle. And you know, that group is that runs counter to the so-called Franco-German engine, which has been considered the most dynamic force in European integration since the very beginning. And this Franco-German engine, frankly speaking, hasn't been working for some time, and I don't think it's working right now. And if you look at the paper, A Strong Europe in a World of Uncertainties, which has just been leaked, a paper by the German and the French foreign ministers, it's singularly unambitious compared to anything that you heard in common statements from Paris and Berlin in the last couple of years. So, you know, I mean, that's the reaction. And besides that, I mean, Angela Merkel has, I think she's treated a very, very fine line between seeming too soft on the Brits and nevertheless emphasizing that we don't want them to cherry pick. They're not going to get a better deal, like having access to the single market, but not accepting freedom of movement. Now, Ben's already talked about that. So I think there's also very little encouragement from Berlin these days for Scottish independence, simply because you know, for the moment, as much as Brussels may be enthusiastic about this, you know, just as a way to get back at the English, I don't think that the Spaniards are going for it. I mean, Mariano Rajoy has just said that Spain will never accept taking Scotland in, and so I think there's also very little enthusiasm in Berlin for that. But indeed, and this is my last point, there are some differences within Berlin. You know, the federal government has seen a couple of spats on foreign policy between the Christian Democrats, Angela Merkel's party, and the Social Democrats, the party of Foreign Minister Steinmeier. That concerned Russia about 10 days ago. It concerned it certainly concerned the general way of how are we going to treat Britain now, and it absolutely concerns the way how the European Union is going forward. I mean, are we going to move? Are we going to move towards a stronger federation, or are we just, you know, holding the line and trying not to let ourselves be divided, but certainly not going for treaty change or anything like that? And I believe there is a difference here between Angela Merkel and her foreign minister, or between Christian Democrats and Social Democrats in Berlin.
Thank you very much, Roland. I'm turning to you, Dalibor, on a couple of points. You actually wrote a very interesting essay recently called "The Conservative Case for the European Union," insisting on the fact that the EU had actually been a very positive force for free market reform on the European continent, both for Western Europe and Eastern Europe, that you know very well, but also, as I think Roland just pointed out, a force for unity against foreign policy challenges and threats, especially Vladimir Putin's Russia. And this leads me to ask you, among other things, what do you think is the perspective on this in Eastern Europe? A lot of people are talking about France, Germany, the US to a certain extent. How is the rest of the European Union, which you know, comprises 28, maybe 27 now states? What's the perspective from other states? And also, if you could add, you know, being in Washington D.C. Yourself as a European analyst and commentator, what do you think the role of the United States could be on this? You know, John Kerry just traveled to Europe to make the case for stronger relations between the European Union and Britain, and not punishing the Brits, as he said. So, what's your take on this?
Well, thank you, Ben. I hope everybody can hear me. I suspect I'll start by saying that this has come as a surprise to Central Europeans as well, looking at the Visegrad countries, at the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Poles, very much like the betting markets or the pollsters who did not expect this outcome. Most people, political elites in these countries, were expecting it. Either Slovakia is taking over the EU, the Council of the EU presidency in 2 days. I don't think the Slovak government is even remotely prepared for what's going to be happening in the coming months, for all the prosperity role it will be expected to play. This arrives at the time when there has been a considerable backlash or disenchantment with the way the EU is run and functions in Central Europe. Only 62% of Slovaks are in favor of Slovakia's continued membership in the EU. I mean, I count as a high number, but compared to what used to be the sort of historical baseline in this part of the world, I think it was indicative of a really strong trend towards Euroscepticism. The Czech Parliament held a vote a month and a half ago about a possible referendum about the Czech Republic's membership in the European Union. 92 out of 200 Czech MPs voted in favor of the motion. There'll be, I think, another round where this thing will be discussed, and there is what would have been just unthinkable 2-3 years ago is now becoming a distinct possibility. Even if we don't talk about it in Hungary and Poland and the attitudes that their governments are taking.
I don't think we could hear you. Can you put the micro back on?
Okay, let's see. If you can't hear me, just let me know. I'm not sure that you can't.
Dalibor, can you speak without the earphones, because I think it's jamming the micro.
Oh,
Wait. Okay, we'll come back to Dalibor just in a couple of minutes. Actually, maybe turning to Ben to talk also about the relation with Russia. You wrote actually about this recently, how Brexit would be seen as a victory for Vladimir Putin and for the forces against of division within the European Union. Can you explain a bit more about how you think this is?
Well, this is not just a victory for Vladimir Putin in any political sense, though it is, of course, that. It's a victory for Vladimir Putin in an ideological sense as well, is that Vladimir Putin has long believed that the European Union, with its self-deluding ideologies, as he would see it, with its bureaucracy, with its sort of various competing national interests, is reminiscent to the Soviet Union in the 1980s and the Eastern Bloc in the 1980s, and that Putin believes that actually only he truly understands globalization and only he truly understands the nature of power in the modern world, and that this ideological construction which doesn't suit nation states and doesn't truly work with globalization or understand that globalization actually benefits authoritarian states more than it does democracies, is certain to implode and unravel at some point, handing Russia, of course, a historical situation where once again it is the greatest and largest country in Europe and not a smaller country compared to a large bloc. How will this help Putin? Firstly, one of the real threats to Russian authorities over the last few years was that serious anti-corruption, anti-money laundering reform would get going in the UK in the sort of premier world financial centre, and then would become a European standard throughout the bloc, preventing Russian officials from doing levels of money laundering which they currently do, or be able to hide their assets and their wealth, and often their families, in the way that they had been doing before. So with Brexit, any of these reforms which appeared to be on the way in the UK are scrapped. In fact, any reforms the government was intending to do, will probably not take place, and that's a topic for the next government to approach. And it's highly unlikely that anything that would harm Britain's now very poor for economic prospects would be included in that. In terms of what it means for Putin further down the line, this opens a possibility that, as part of the difficult negotiations that will take place in the EU, in order to win people around onto various aspects of future Brexit negotiations, there will be a possibility for those such as Italy, who seek to reverse EU-wide Russia sanctions, to gain some terrain. It's to be noted that the EU Big Three is now, of course, sort of Paris, Rome, and Berlin. It's no longer Paris, London, and Berlin. So that's going to be interesting. I think that right now there'll be a lot of euphoria in Russia, which will see it undoubtedly in the same way that Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage saw the event in the European Parliament the other day. I think they're mistaken. I think, and this is only my sense at the moment, is that this will provide a real wake-up call to France about the dangers of populism, and it'll be an event that will be very seriously studied in Paris as it approaches the 2017 presidential election. It'll be studied in the United States as the forthcoming Hillary-Trump contest approaches, and there may even be, without the United Kingdom in the European Union, more of a possibility for deeper integration over the next few years.
Yeah, before Roland, let me follow up a little bit on this. I mean, I totally agree with you on France. I think the prospect of the rise of populism movement in France, the threat of Marine Le Pen, who is actually polling very high today in France. I mean, she is not in a position to become the president if the election were held tomorrow, but she certainly is a very high spoiler. She would arrive first in the first round. The election were held today, and gather maybe 35–40% in the second round. So she's certainly shaping the public debate and putting pro-European, pro-liberal, pro-globalization forces on the defensive. And I think this actually helps shed a light on the behavior by the French authorities today, who really want to set an example, who don't want to be lenient on Britain and show how damaging for the economy, for the diplomatic isolation of the country, such paths can be. So the UK will be set as an example. I think this is where you have maybe different perspectives between Hollande and Merkel. Hollande sees first the opportunities for deeper integration within the European Union, the necessity to get back on track with other priorities, because the EU, with such a burdensome decision-making process, is famously bad at tackling different issues at the same time, right? And there you have different challenges, from the refugee issues to the lingering economic crisis to threats on the periphery, from the continuing situation in Ukraine to ISIS in Libya. I think the longer the discussion with the UK keeps going on, the longer it will hijack the priorities for the European Union. So I think there's this, and there's also the threat of populism in France that will explain why Hollande and the French are trying to push for a swift a resolution of this. They are pushing the UK to trigger Article 50 as quickly as possible and to be tough afterwards on the UK. I think Merkel has another perspective where she is thinking about the future. She's thinking about the importance of the strong bond strategically, economically, politically between the UK and the European Union. So I think you have these different perspectives, but it's certainly good news for the Kremlin. I've read some reports that Brexit may have been funded or organized by the Kremlin. I think that's way overestimating the influence that Vladimir Putin can have in European politics. What is true is that the public debate in our democracies in Europe, but even to a certain extent now in the United States, is shaped in a new way. The right-left divide, as it is organized, is less. It was more and more obsolete, and the true structuring issues are the relation to openness, I would say, to liberalism, to globalization, to Europe. And you have populist forces on the left or on the right. You've seen the progress of Podemos just a couple of days ago in the Spanish elections, and obviously Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. But the National Front, the AfD in Germany, or now the ideological triumph for UKIP in a way in the United Kingdom, that shows that the dividing lines are shifting. And
Well, I'd like to jump in there because I've got a sort of controversial comment, which is that I think one of the only British politician who actually understands what is happening is Nigel Farage. And Nigel Farage correctly understands that the British population is voting against ethnic change. And I did a 10-day road trip around the Midlands and Middle England in order to try and find out how people were voting. And every town I went to, I asked 100 people, why are you voting Leave? And almost unanimously, people said they were voting Leave because of immigration. When I asked them, what do you mean about immigration? They went, oh, we mean Muslims, or we mean foreigners in the government, or we mean Polish shops, or the English becoming a minority. And what they mean by immigration, in everyday English as it's spoken, is ethnic change. And Nigel Farage correctly understands this, and he believes that America is voting against ethnic change with Donald Trump, and France, a large part of France, is voting against ethnic change with Marine Le Pen, and that in order this process of the rejection of ethnic change may well break up the West, and that he also believes that it is necessary to break the Old West because the institutions of the West embed cosmopolitanism. The European Union embeds cosmopolitanism through free movement, ensures and was designed to ensure that old monoethnic states would be undermined in various ways, and that's why he and Marine Le Pen are rejoicing. I think that in the UK, what I've seen, to add in a further element of denial, is, and I hate using this term as it makes me sound like a sort of grumpy Daily Mail columnist, which we've heard quite enough over the past few months, but too many British commentators are cultural Marxists who believe that everything is actually about class and everything is actually about economics, and that even though the voters may say they're voting against ethnic change, in fact what they're voting against is the establishment, or in fact what they're voting against is class or social exclusion. And I really don't believe this, and I think this is very comforting for a lot of especially centre, liberal and left-wing journalists not to face up to the reality.
Yeah, I actually think it's very interesting. I don't think it's only the left. You do have this temptation among liberals in general, center-left, center-right, to think that deep down it's only about economics. As long as you address the underlying economic challenges, everything else will follow. There was a very good political reporting actually from a couple of days ago on the inner workings of the campaign and the reason why the Remain camp lost. And I think that was one of the key points, is that the Tories decided, the Remain camp of the Tories, so Cameron and his staff, decided to focus the economic on a pragmatic bread and butter message, saying, staying in the EU is very transactional. Staying in the EU is, you'll be better off with jobs, with economic growth. And the Leave camp decided to focus this election on identity and take control back, by the way, which was the slogan of the Leave camp. Is about identity, it's about immigration, it's about values, it's about much more than only, I would say, technical and economic issues. And this is, by the way, a challenge for the European in general. The whole European project, I believe, was based on the idea that as long as you create technical solidarity on issues, you will, progressively create political bonds that political solidarity will follow. You create the steel and coal community, and progressively you will follow up to defense or sovereignty or sharing of political culture. And I think we're at a time where if see that the European Union can protect them on hardcore security issues, on immigration, on defense. There's going to be a great temptation to go back to national solutions. Roland, you wanted to jump in a bit earlier. Tell me what you think.
Exactly. Look, I mean, as much as I admit that everyone has underestimated, everyone except Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen and so on, have underestimated identity politics in the last couple of years. True. And I think it's definitely one of the defining axes now in European politics. Well, not only European, actually. But, let's not go overboard. I mean, there is still a question to be answered. I mean, do we print money? Do we believe that protectionism, more regulation, more state interventionism, more stimulus is going to actually bring us back to sustainable growth? Or do we believe that you can only spend what you have, or what you've earned, or what you're at least sure you are going to earn in a certain limited amount of time? You know, that question has not disappeared. And I'm sorry, but this is the old left-right divide in European politics, and it has become, in the Euro crisis, a North-South divide. And here I'm really sorry to say that if now the forces of globalization and openness and so on forget that question of how exactly are we going to give, how are we going to return to growth, how are we going to somehow create prosperity in the future, if we forget that question and we only divide the world and the universe into globalists and territorialists, I think then we do the populists a huge favor. Because then, actually, you know what? The selling point of populists in the European Parliament for the last 2-3 elections has always been those ladies and gentlemen up on Barrymore Hill, where the European Parliament and the Commission and the Council are located. Those ladies and gentlemen, they can paint their faces blue, green, red, or yellow. They all want the same thing. They want money out of your pocket. They want power from the little people to the neon-lit corridors of Brussels. And you know, if we corroborate that narrative, that now there's no more difference between social democrats and conservatives and liberals and Christian Democrats, I think we're doing them a huge favor, and we should not do that. European politics has shifted towards identity politics, that's true, but that doesn't mean that the other paradigm or the other spectrum of like what I would call responsible fiscal, economic and social policies and irresponsible ones has disappeared. So that's my point here. You know, we still have to, I actually think that if Europe wants to deliver, it has to become less regulated, less bureaucratic, more grassroots oriented, and then we produce the results that will at least contribute to a turnaround in this trend of growing populism and nationalism.
And do you think this Europe that can be less bureaucratic and more grassroots can actually be one of the consequences of the coming years and the process of withdrawal from Great Britain? I mean, we hear very different scenarios. Actually, some French and Germans advocating for deeper integration or deeper centralization, maybe at the European level. Now that the country that was one of the key obstacles to integration is maybe on its way out.
Ben, you know, I admit this. When I hear deeper integration, I cringe. I mean, first of all, I don't know what it exactly means. Whoever talks about deeper integration has to explain to me, what exactly do they want? A European finance minister that tells national parliaments that you can only adopt this budget but not that budget? Are we talking about a transfer union? where, I mean, sorry to be so blunt, but the German taxpayer pays for what Germans would consider the follies of Mediterranean spending politics. You know, are we talking about that deeper Europe? I would say no thanks. Are we talking about, on the other hand, a Europe with, say, a much better and institutionalized exchange of intelligence on terrorist, on upcoming terrorist attacks against Europe? Are we going to talk about a more institutionalized exchange of best practice on de-radicalization? Are we talking about a Europe that finally gets its act together on defense and defense spending, but not only spending, and a Europe which actually carries its own share of the burden on security, thereby you know, actually helping American politicians to keep the transatlantic link? You know, if that is a deeper Europe, hey, I'm all in favor. But you know, we need to specify what exactly we're talking about. What I do not see at this very moment, after Britain has decided to leave, is the kind of sursaut fédéraliste, you know, this kind of a jump forward in terms of a stronger a European superstate, if you want. I mean, that's the negative way to put it. I just don't see it because, you know, frankly speaking, Germany and France have, in the last 30 years, rarely been as much at odds about all strategic questions as they are now. So if this axis is somehow not fully working, I don't see how we could get to either a core Europe of, like, you know, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 core countries forming a strong union and then a periphery around it, or to get to, I mean, I don't know, a much institutionally strengthened Eurozone. I mean, all these are possibilities how you could interpret the term a deeper European integration, but I just don't see that.
Dalibor, do you wanna follow on this? Oh, yeah, I don't think we can hear you.
Switch on your mic, Dalibor.
Yeah. Dalibor, I think unfortunately your mic is not working. To follow actually a little bit on what Roland just said, I tend to agree with you, but I think we should overcome the vocabulary that has become really obsolete of sovereignist versus federalist. I think these are debates from the 80s and the 90s that don't make much sense anymore, because apart from you only have a very small minority on both sides who either want to go back full sovereignty and totally abandon the European project or any kind of cooperation between European countries, and on the other hand, like a very small minority of intellectual elites who who defend a federalist program. I think the vast majority of people now are what you could call sort of enlightened Eurosceptics. You know, I don't like using the term Eurosceptic for people like Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage because they're anti-European, but I think Eurosceptics, which are people who are in favor of a form of European integration and European cooperation, but see that the current model is broken, not entirely broken, but at least flawed and needs to be fixed. What you could clearly imagine a system where you have deeper integration, even though the expression makes you cringe, but I think at least deeper cooperation when it comes to defense. And clearly the United Kingdom was one of the main obstacles on this, being against funding for the European Defense Agency, for example, or being against the having operational headquarters in Brussels. These are projects, concrete projects, on which European countries could move forward. Today, we're not talking about a European army, which at this stage seems very implausible, but at least like deeper cooperation to tackle common challenges. The same way the Atalanta naval operation, which is headed by Britain, by the way, it has been fighting piracy in the Horn of Africa. And same thing for the Eurozone. I think you could have deeper integration and cooperation on fiscal coordination, on maybe having some sort of equivalent of a European finance minister who would improve budget and fiscal coordination between member states. If you want to have a common currency, it's unfortunately the consequence. Yet at the same time, acknowledge that a deeper union is not necessarily what's needed for everything else, and that there's been a trend to abandon the principle of subsidiarity, which was at the heart of the repartition of competence between the Commission and the member states. You know, the principle of the European Union was based on the idea that what can't be done at a national level will be done at the European level. And I think for ideological reasons, we sort of changed. We've never really said it explicitly, but this has changed over the last couple of decades, maybe since the Maastricht Treaty, saying, well, the more we can do at the European level, the better. And maybe we're going to go back to, from scaling back and giving back some competence to member states. That doesn't mean necessarily an erosion of the European Union. It just means doing things where they're better fit at the different levels. That's what the Dutch government has been advocating, actually, with they had a repartition of competence review a couple of years ago to make subsidiarity better work. So I think, Jacques Delors, the president of the European Commission in the 80s and late and early 90s, used to say we're a federation of nation states. So the European Union is sort of an institutional UFO. It's often compared in its evolution in the United States. I don't think it makes much sense. It's a different organization that has a different purpose. That comes with different culture and identity, and I think this is why this opposition between sovereignists and federalists, I think, blurs the debate more than it helps us intellectually.
If I can you hear me now? And I do apologize for all the troubles. I think I would go even further than Roland on this issue, which is that I think I've become relatively pessimistic about what's coming next, because the EU is in fact in a hard place. There are some fundamental structural deficiencies in the construction of the Eurozone, with the Schengen area, the absence of common security and foreign policy, and that to some extent fuels some of the discontent. I mean, the EU has been having sort of fundamental problems. It's not just about perceptions, just about identity politics. And right now, with the fallout from Brexit, with the rising populism, even modest, reasonable, defensible steps that could conceivably fix these problems, I think will be much tougher to sell politically than before. And I think there'll be much more pushback, much more hysteria, even around things like strengthening Frontex, strengthening fiscal governance within the Eurozone, things that are not a jump towards a federal superstate, but things that are that like anybody reasonable should essentially support. And also, completing the single market, I think, will become much harder without the UK's voice at the table, and without a single market that works, it will be, I suppose, much more difficult for the EU to deliver the goods. I mean, to reverse the productivity slowdown we've seen in recent years, to do something with the unemployment rates on the periphery, etc. So I see this as a very tough situation right now, and I'm not sure we are going to get the leadership that can sort of overcome these obstacles.
Thank you, Dalibor. And actually, to come back to what you were saying earlier before being interrupted for technical reasons, can you maybe shed a light also on what is the view of other members? We were talking about Eastern European countries. It's actually interesting to see. I think the Polish president has called for a second referendum. Even Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's often seen as one of the main critics of the European Union as it is today, has taken an ad in the British press to ask the UK to stay within the European Union. This is counterintuitive for some of us who follow on a day-to-day basis the debates within the European Union. Can you explain a little bit what's going on?
Well, I think there are two basic forces at play in Central Europe. One has to do with the free movement of labor, the fact that so many of these countries have so many of their citizens in the UK. I mean, it's like 790,000 Poles living in the UK, 50,000 Slovaks. I don't know how many Czechs or Hungarians, but the numbers are large. And I think in that sense, there's every interest that these countries have in keeping the UK in the EU, or at least within the European economic area, with the free movement of people. And the second force, though, which is in place, is the fact that these governments either are themselves fairly Eurosceptic, as it is the case in Poland or Hungary, or are being challenged from the far right, and will soon face elections. I mean, that's particularly the case of the Czech Republic, where there's a social democratic coalition built around social democrats that probably won't survive after the next election. And so there's this fear of domestic populism, domestic nationalist pressures that I think are making these governments adopt a much harder line against Brussels. So there have been these calls for Juncker to resign, or for Schulz to resign, that have been coming from out of Prague and other Central European capitals. And in that sense, it might even be helpful if some sort of symbolic politics took place in Brussels, some sort of self-flagellation. Oh, we really failed, and we have to do something, even if it's sort of substantively meaningless. But if it's still the same figures saying the same things, I think the sort of discontent is going to brew even further.
Yeah, sorry. Can I just come in on 2 points here? One, I think it's really important to see that as much as Central European governments are opposed to Brussels and find Juncker abominable and all that, yes, but no one seriously, except for the very, very, very extreme far right, wants to leave the European Union. And that's not only about money. I mean, yes, of course, it's the regional funds, it's the structural funds, it's all the instruments of economic solidarity that the European Union has, and from which these countries hugely profit. All right, that's one factor. But the other one is that, well, just look at the two ideological proponents, the protagonists of a kind of more nationalist and more ethnocentric rollback in Central Europe. That's the Hungarians and the Poles, and they absolutely considered Britain their ally against a European Commission, and of course the West European member states, that insists on such stupid things as the rule of law, checks and balances. I mean, Britain was a manifest ally, irrespective of what Brits themselves think about liberal democracy. But if it came to opposing the Brussels institutions, Britain was definitely a very, very strong ally to these two governments, and so they have no interest in Britain leaving. And the Poles were ready to sell very, very substantial privileges of their 790,000 citizens in the United Kingdom in return for a British support against the Commission about the rule of law, and then probably some troops. We'll see next week how this plays out at the NATO summit, but some direct transfer of British troops to Poland. Now, so that's the one thing. The other point I would like to make is, indeed, you do have, after the Brexit referendum, you had calls for in-out referenda in at least 7 European Union countries, East and West, North and South. But I just give you one figure, that in the last 6 days, there was a majority, before there was a majority of French who were in favor of a French exit from the European Union. Today, it's 45% for remaining, 30% for leaving, and the rest undecided. So within 6 days, that balance has manifestly, massively shifted inside France, and depending on how chaotic the situation will develop now in Great Britain, you're going to see a lot of insecurity on the continent about leaving the European Union. So, I wouldn't be that pessimistic about the imminent collapse or implosion of the European Union.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roland. I actually totally agree with both these points. Actually, but to follow up on the French situation, we have Manuel Lafont Rapnouil, who is the head of the ECFR office in Paris, European Council on Foreign Relations, who has just joined us. Manuel, can you tell us a little bit more about what you think the French perspective is on this, and also shed some light on the security dimension? We mentioned a bit earlier that the UK has always been a reluctant member of the European Union on many fronts, but especially on the question of defense integration. So, is this counterintuitively maybe good news for European defense? What does it mean for security issues for coming forward?
Okay, thank you. First, I want to apologize for being late. This is not a sign of chaos that reigns in Europe since Friday. It's just my own personal chaos, and I apologize for that. Actually, the French view about the situation is quite well summed up by a joke that goes on now, which says that basically, with a view to what is going to be renegotiated in terms of the relation between the EU and the UK. The UK used to be 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and if Europeans don't pay attention, soon enough it will be the other way around. Just because there is this idea that the UK is always trying to get the best of both worlds. And I think one of the key ideas for the French right now in terms of renegotiating is clarify the situation as soon as possible, which is why you have seen this push about the EU invoking Article 50, the UK, sorry, invoking Article 50 sooner rather than later, and the negotiation being opened. The idea is not that this will clarify and be solved soon enough. This is just that you need the clarity that the opening of the negotiation will allow, and which is why the French have been asking for that article to be invoked, that article being the one through which the UK will notify its decision to leave. There will be a double negotiation, a negotiation on the terms of the divorce, if I can say so, and the discussion on what the new relationship will be. And the French view on that is quite clearly, leave means leave. So you will start from where everybody starts, which is the default situation is WTO status, basically. And the idea is, I've seen in the press a lot of comments about France wants to punish the UK, etc. I think that's pretty much nonsense. But leave means leaves is a way to say, if you want better the WTO status, if you want some more advantages, then you will get some of the constraints that come with it. One of the models that is discussed a lot is the Norwegian model. Norwegian model basically is access to the single market, and to balance that advantages, it comes with strings attached, which is you contribute to the EU budget, and you sign up to EU regulations, even though you don't negotiate it, because you're not part of the decision-making process. And by the way, Norway is also a member of Schengen. I think all the strings attached are exactly the kind of strings that the UK voted against. So that promises to be quite difficult. I think the statements made by the 27 saying the 4 freedoms of for goods, but also freedoms of circulation for workers, they all come as a package. You can't just cherry pick which freedom you want and which you will leave on the table. That's the first thing. And second, if you want some of the advantages, including, for instance, access to the single market, you will get some of the strings attached alongside the model of the privileged relationship that already exists, like with Norway or with Switzerland. To just comment on what has been said, I do fully agree with the idea that there is not a major risk of contagion and collapse. I know, because I'm French and I live in France, I know that every time there has been a referendum, the polls at the beginning were quite positive, and it didn't always end up in a positive manner. So I would take those polls with some degree of caution. But nonetheless, I believe first that no EU leader will call upon a referendum for an exit if he is not in favor of exits. You would need a leader like Marine Le Pen to be in power to have a French referendum on Brexit or not. So depending on whether you believe she can be elected in 2017, you can see that maybe there's a risk, but there definitely is no risk until 2017 for sure. And I'm not sure that this perspective is going to help her in her campaign, precisely because of the kind of polls that has just been mentioned, and also because of the kind of much less utilitarian and much less instrumentalistic relation to the EU that France has with compared to the UK. In terms of security and defense, that's definitely a big French concern. That has always been the case, but it is even more so with the current situation, and that's not just terrorism. That's also French military commitment overseas, in the Middle East, in the Sahel region. When Hollande was in Berlin with Renzi and Merkel, they tried to find a way forward, which is also another way to try to avoid contagion. And the way forward that they are looking for is basically focusing on three topics. The first is economy and social cohesion, and that's including long-term investment, education, youth employment. But the two others are exactly that: security and defense. I am not sure that we will stick to the three, because the idea is also to be more inclusive and to get as much members on board, and so you need to attend to other EU members' concerns also. But definitely that are things that France has been pushing and will try to push. The question is, on the international stage, can the EU be still credible and significant without the UK? First, I believe it is still possible. In defense in particular, obviously the UK is a very significant player, but it has had very little commitment to European defense so far. And that actually, that on many issues be an obstacle to further progress for the EU. So obviously the best situation would be a committed UK to European defense pillar, but you can do some stuff without the UK, and this is what we have done so far. So this is not a big blow to the EU. It's probably more a blow to its potential than a blow to what it is going to be able to achieve. On security, I think there are many things that the EU can do and that the UK will join, like sanctions. Obviously, I don't see the UK sanctions, which has been a key tool of French, but also European security policy. Sanctions will remain strong, and obviously the UK will probably do some kind of sanction of its own, but will also align to other kind of sanctions. And the more it will be linked to the single market and to the EU for economic reasons, the more incentive it will have to also join the EU sanctions. So I don't see that as a major problem for further EU security standing.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Following up on security issues.
Can I ask Manuel a question?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of. Can you just elaborate on François Hollande and Euro clearing, and François Hollande on the City of London, and what this means for the City of London's incredibly privileged position already? Because today there's been a real shock in London as it's beginning to sink in that the City of London will not have its current position as the European Union's financial centre.
Well, yeah, I think you said it quite clearly. I don't see any reason why, as I said, leave means leave, and that's for the French, but that was said quite clearly by Hollande. But I don't think that's only the French. Luxembourg is also organizing to try to get some benefits from the move of financial activity from London to other EU countries. Obviously, the Germany Germany is very much interested because of the size of the Frankfurt stock exchange place. Ireland also believes that it can get some advantages from that, so that's pretty clear. The question is, if you want to access single market, including the financial services free market, then it comes with all the rest. You can't just cherry pick that. That makes pretty much sense, and I don't see the UK being willing to accept all that comes with this access to the single market, including the financial service. Norway has an access to all the single market. It has all the strings attached that I talked about a bit earlier, and many more. Switzerland has a ad hoc access to part of the single market, and the strings attached are proportional to these kind of things. But the more ad hoc relation the UK will want to negotiate, the more difficult it will be for it to get the benefits on issues where the EU wants to integrate more, which is including on the banking union, the Eurozone integration, etc.
Do you think that there's I don't know if you could explain a little bit more about if the likely next president is, you know, maybe from the centre, like Monsieur Macron, or maybe from the right, like Alain Juppé, how would this shape the renegotiation?
No, I don't think I can say. I'm not sure it will be much different because it is structured by it will be shaped by very structural interest. But I really can't say, and I think that there's a lot of speculations right now in the press about what is going to be French position, what is going to be the German position. Nobody knows the British position, and everything will begin with the British position. So it's quite. There are already things which are clear because they've been mentioned already, including this financial services issue, the passporting, etc. But to go more into details and into nuances, I think is pretty much different. That's the first thing. Second, as I have said, this will be a collective negotiation between the EU and the UK, not just a bilateral Franco-UK relation. And what the French have said on those issues are very similar to what other countries are saying or have been thinking on the same issues.
If I may just say a few words on sort of the options for renegotiation, also what it means from a US angle. I believe that there is very little appetite for crafting some sort of tailored ad hoc arrangement that would give some specific sort of privileged position to the UK relative to other non-EU member states. I think there are basically two options. One is the EEA, sort of Iceland, Norway kind of thing, where 23 out of 35 chapters of EU law continue to be applied, where the UK continues to be part of the free movement of people, etc., etc. From my perspective, I think that would be that's the least economically destructive option. The UK has benefited from immigration from the EU. That's part of why London is a global city, and the UK has benefited from the absence of non-tariff barriers. Going back to some WTO kind of arrangement would really mean a potentially large disruptive effect, would have potentially large disruptive effect on the UK economy. And in fact, some of the sort of more free market-minded levers, when you press them, that's what they had in mind for Brexit. That it's not a disruptive change, but a change of direction, if you will, while still being part of the European single market. Obviously, it would be an immensely difficult political sell, given the reasons why people voted for leave. Those are not the reasons that Dan Hannan or whoever on the sort of free market leave side supported the idea of Brexit. From a US perspective, though, I think the United States have every interest in making sure that there is a soft landing economically and also sort of geopolitically. If there is a long, acrimonious, painful divorce, it's necessarily going to have an impact on NATO. 22 EU member states are members of NATO. If these countries start trusting each other less, if there is, there's the same leaders who go to these summits, and so I think what the US is doing right now with Kerry trying to talk some sense into people is, broadly speaking, the right strategy. It's probably coming too late, considering that it's past the referendum and Kerry was nowhere to be seen. During, for example, Cameron's renegotiation. And I think there's also every reason in Washington to try to do something about the trade links between the US and Europe, whether it means TTIP or a potential UK-US trade deal, which might be easier to negotiate than TTIP. Whether we'll see anything on that front before the election is another question. I don't think we'll see much progress on either before next year.
Let me come back to Manuel actually with the U.S. role. As we mentioned earlier, John Kerry was in Europe this week. Some commentators saw this as sort of an awkward visit at the moment with Europeans who are, as you say, still trying to figure out their own position. What do you think? Do you think the U.S. role can be or should be, if any, in this moment?
Well, I think what President Obama basically said, meaning this is not the outcome that I had wished for. I including pretty clearly, very clearly, loudly said that I was in favor of the other outcome. But I respect it, and I will try to keep as good relations as possible with Europe, whether countries are within the EU or outside the EU. Is probably the best thing that the US can do. I'm not sure. I don't see a need for a mediation, and I think that's overstating really what Kerry has in mind. I think it's very good that he does consult and try to understand. Everybody is trying to understand. And the difficulty in trying to understand is that some of the key players' positions are not that clear. To begin with, the British position. And so it's a good thing to go and consult and see what is possible. But come on, we are not to a point where we need a mediation between the UK and the EU. We need some interlocutor on the UK side to be able to begin a conversation. And I don't see any reason why the negotiation should give bad blood or anything. Again, there's a decision. The decision comes with consequences. Obviously, this is not going to be agreeable because the consequences are not going to be positive, in my view, and in the view of many. But again, the idea is not to punish anyone. The idea is not to ill-treat anyone, and I don't see why that would give bad blood, especially not to the point where that brings mistrust or problems between NATO allies. On the contrary, I believe that most of these countries, and certainly on military and defense issues, the French and the UK are going to try to continue to cooperate bilaterally as good as possible, as much as possible, to show that there is no radical consequences in terms of the UK is not going to become an island isolated from the rest of Europe. That is not going to happen.
Well, I'd like to jump in there. Running around in Whitehall and Westminster and in the city over this very intense and sort of emotional week for London, I can report to you that there are various levels of denial. The first is the denial from the Remainers, who are in a state of denial that the UK will actually leave and believe that they can prevent Article 50 being triggered, or that as the recession or the economic shock fall in, that maybe the UK won't actually leave, or it can form a sort of privileged partnership. And you have a lot of very important and senior commentators saying, no, maybe we can avoid this somehow. In Parliament, there's a lot of denial that this has actually taken place, and maybe you can avoid this. Within the Conservative Party, there is a near complete state of denial that out means out, that leave means leave. They refuse to accept it. And within the Brexit camp, there is a whistling and happy songs, a simple refusal to understand or engage with the European Union's position. And I think that the result of this is going to be that simply outlining the terms as you would see them, not in a punitive manner, will be interpreted as punitive and cruel. Just today, I sort of tweeted what is in the news, that so Hollande does not want Britain to retain euro clearing, and that euro clearing will so likely as a result of this be moved back, and that passporting is not an option. This became one of the most trending topics in the UK, with people tweeting betrayal, shock, how can this be possible, I feel sick. But there's just no level of understanding here. And in a lot of ways, this is comparable to the Greek, this is comparable to the public and the establishment's level of comprehension of the European Union that we saw in the Greek referendum.
Can I just come in here, because I think Ben just touched a very important point. The Leave camp will have a tremendous amount of explaining to do over the next couple of weeks and months. I mean, why has paradise not begun in Britain? I mean, that's what they promised before the referendum. So, I mean, there is bound to be a part of the Leave camp, and if it's only Farage, but I think it's going to be many, many more people than just Nigel Farage, who are going to blame a vengeful Brussels on all the ills that now befall the island. And you know, this is inevitable somehow. So I think, yes, we need to avoid bad blood. Yes, we need to sit down and talk rationally. But please, let's be aware that in England itself, there are powerful forces which are actually going to evolve over the next couple of weeks into forces that have an interest in a actually divorce battle rather than an amicable agreement, and we just need to be aware of this. But on the other hand, let me just come back to one point about the four freedoms, and especially the freedom of movement. Now, on this point, I do see some light at the end of the tunnel, because I mean, you know, even in the deal that Cameron negotiated with the 27 before the referendum, the only substantial point that he really got was a limitation of rights to social benefits by migrant workers during the first 4 years of their presence in Britain. And I'll tell you something, this is not only a British interest. There are several countries on the continent, not least Germany, at least the state of Bavaria, where you have exactly the same demand that we need to somehow curb a total equality as to social benefits when it comes to migrants from within the European Union. I think this is one point where Britain will at least be able to keep its opt-out from the free movement that it negotiated before the referendum. So, you know, it's not all black and white, and it's not all denial and delusion on the British side. You know, on a couple of points, I think Britain has some allies on the continent when it comes to freedom of movement. And, you know, maybe that's a good sign after all.
Fair. But there is, I think, a difference between freedom of movement per se and the sort of extent of social services and welfare extended to migrant workers, for example, and to the outcome of the renegotiation when it came to in-work benefits from the UK side was relatively trivial in terms of the saving that would have been made annually by denying migrant workers these tax deductions or whatever what these instruments were, and to some extent there already are measures in place that limit the ability of people who move within the EU to claim social benefits, especially after the Alimanovic case, where the ECJ ruled very clearly that member states have the right to deny welfare benefits to people who just migrate for the sake of claiming them. I mean, if we could sort of entrench that principle that this is within the control of member states, I think that could maybe alleviate some of the sort of concerns that people have over free movement of labour within the EU. But I don't think that really solves the entire issue in the way Leavers wanted it to have it solved. I mean, to the extent to which it was really driven by identity politics in the UK.
we have any follow-up on this?
Well, I just thought the kind of final point would be that all major UK political institutions now broken. The Labour Party is in a state of catastrophe, with the MPs renouncing the leader refusing to leave, the members staging protests against the MPs. But the leader unable to win support in the constituencies. The Conservative Party's broken. The government's broken. The Whitehall had made no plans for this. Is also sort of broken. The Liberal Democrat Party was broken before the Union is breaking. So it's incredibly uncertain. We're just not sure what's happening. And I think that a couple of comments made by European leaders, including the leaders of Germany and the leaders of the Netherlands, that things are in such meltdown in England right now, but Scotland is actually rather well run at the moment, that it's very unclear where we'll be in a few weeks. People believe this to be, in Britain right now, a momentous realignment of British politics.
Thank you, Ben. I think we're going to conclude on these words after this week of extreme confusion and fog, and we're still looking ahead at more confusion and Europeans trying to come to grip with this new situation, this realignment not only of UK politics, as you rightly said, Ben, but of whole continental politics and Atlantic politics in many respects. I really like to thank the four speakers for this extremely lively and enriching conversation. We'll be putting it on the Hudson website. It'll be on YouTube and shared afterwards on Twitter and Facebook, so you can come back to it. Don't miss the two books of our speakers. Obviously, This is London by Ben Judah, and Towards an Imperfect Union: A Conservative Case for the European Union by Dalibor Rohac. Thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll probably have another conversation on this topic or a comparable topic in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much, and good evening in Europe and good afternoon in the United States.
Thank you.
Dankeschön.
Thanks. Bye.